History loves simple stories. One gunshot, one assassin, one tragic mistake that sent the world tumbling into catastrophe. It is neat, clean, and wrong. The First World War was not born in a Sarajevo street. It was already alive, breathing, and hungry long before the first bullet was fired. Beneath the speeches and ceremonies, beneath the flags and alliances, there was a quieter war unfolding. A war of steel, oil, debt, and railways. And at the center of it stood a single line of iron stretching across empires. What follows is not the version taught in classrooms. It is the story behind the story, the one written in balance sheets and shipping routes, in deserts and boardrooms. To understand why millions vanished into trenches, and why the Middle East still bears the scars of that age, we must begin not with a murder, but with a map. We are taught that World War I began with 2 shots fired in Sarajevo, that a single assassination triggered a tragic chain reaction no one truly wanted. It is a version of history designed to be digestible, safe enough for textbooks and young minds. But that explanation collapses under scrutiny. It ignores the hard mathematics of empire, the ruthless logic of economics, and the silent wars already underway long before 1914. To understand why entire generations were swallowed by trench warfare, and why the Middle East looks the way it does today, you have to look beyond the assassin's pistol. Look instead at a world map from the year 1900. On it, find the one thing that frightened the British Empire more than any fleet or army. It was not a weapon. It was a railway. This is the story of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. An iron artery meant to link the factories of Central Europe to the oil-rich lands of the Middle East. A project designed to bypass Britain's grip on global trade, and in doing so, threaten the very foundations of its empire. It is also the story of how the Ottoman Empire, desperate to escape financial strangulation by London and Paris, stepped into a geopolitical snare that would tear it apart. To grasp the scale of this tragedy, we must first understand the world as it stood at the dawn of the 20th century. Britain ruled the globe not by sheer size but by control. Its dominance rested on 2 pillars. The first was the Royal Navy, unrivaled and omnipresent, policing the world's oceans. The second was the Suez Canal, Britain's true strategic heartbeat. Suez was the empire's lifeline, the shortest route to India, the crown jewel of British power. Whoever controlled that canal controlled access to the East. As long as Britain held Suez, it decided who traded with Asia and on what terms. German merchants, Russian traders, anyone seeking access to India or China, had to pass through British hands. British ports. British rules. But in the heart of Europe, a new force was rising. Unified in 1871, Germany was rapidly transforming into an industrial giant. Its factories rivaled and often surpassed Britain's output. German science led the world. Its engineers, chemists, and manufacturers were redefining modern industry. Yet Germany faced a fatal limitation. It lacked an empire. No vast colonies. No guaranteed access to cheap raw materials. And worst of all, no navy capable of challenging Britain's control of the seas. Germany was a continental colossus, boxed in by rivals and cut off from global markets by British warships. To the southeast lay another empire in decline, the Ottomans. Once feared across continents, they had by the late 19th century earned the grim nickname, the sick man of Europe. Territory had been lost in the Balkans. The army lagged behind modern standards. But the deepest wound was financial. By 1881, the Ottoman state was bankrupt. Crushed by loans from British and French banks, it was forced to surrender control of its own economy to the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a board dominated by European creditors. Taxes collected from Ottoman farmers no longer funded the Sultan's government. Revenues from salt, silk, and tobacco flowed straight into vaults in London and Paris. The empire still ruled, but it no longer owned itself. Sultan Abdul Hamid too understood the danger. He knew foreign capital was hollowing out his state from within. He needed modernization without submission, strength without dependency. Above all, he needed infrastructure. A railway that could move troops from Constantinople to distant frontiers in days, not months. A railway built on Ottoman terms. But there was one problem. If Britain or France built it, they would simply tighten the leash. This is where German and Ottoman ambitions collided and aligned. Kaiser Wilhelm II saw what others did not. A railway linking Berlin to Constantinople, and from there to Baghdad and the Persian Gulf, would redraw the map of power. It would create a land route immune to British naval dominance. German goods could flow east without ever touching a British-controlled sea lane. Picture it: steel, machinery and chemicals rolling from Berlin through Vienna, across the Balkans into Anatolia and onward to the Indian Ocean. An overland artery the Royal Navy could not intercept. Industrial Germany fused with Middle Eastern resources. For the Sultan it was salvation. For Germany, a gateway to global power. For Britain it was an existential threat. Construction began under German financing and expertise, led by Deutsche Bank. Engineers blasted tunnels through hostile mountains and laid track across unforgiving deserts. It was one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects of its age. And as the rails crept eastward, panic set in London. British strategists stared at their maps and saw a blade aimed at the empire's heart. A completed railway could place German forces within striking distance of the Suez Canal. It could flood Indian markets with German goods. But trade was not the greatest danger. Oil was. At the turn of the century, oil was beginning to replace coal as the lifeblood of navies. It burned hotter, cleaner, and allowed ships to sail farther and faster. Britain knew conversion was unavoidable, but Britain had no oil of its own. It depended on supplies from Persia and abroad. Geologists soon realized that Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, sat atop vast reserves of oil. And the Berlin-Baghdad Railway cut straight through it. Germany secured mineral rights extending 20 kilometers on either side of the track. If the railway reached the sea, Germany would control the fuel of future warfare. The British Navy itself would depend on oil flowing through German-influenced territory. That could not be allowed. Britain moved swiftly and quietly. Diplomacy came first. The Sheikh of Kuwait, ruler of the railway's intended terminus, was pressured into a secret agreement forbidding any foreign power from leasing land without British approval. The railway was effectively blocked from reaching the Persian Gulf, a masterstroke that turned the line into a road to nowhere. Next came propaganda. British newspapers portrayed the Ottomans as barbarians and the Germans as enablers of tyranny. The railway was framed not as commerce but as oppression. Then came finance. London, the world's financial hub, refused to back the project, hoping to choke it of funds. But Germany pressed on. By 1914, the tracks had reached southern Anatolia. Completion was within reach. The threat was real. Seen through this lens, the outbreak of World War I looks very different. The rivalries were not merely about borders or pride, they were about who would control the world's economic future. The Triple Entente formed to contain Germany. Russia feared a strengthened Ottoman state. France feared German industrial dominance. Britain feared losing India, Suez, and control of oil. When war erupted, Britain's gaze did not immediately turn toward Berlin. It turned toward the Middle East. The Ottomans believed they could survive by aligning with Germany. A German victory, they hoped, would erase their debts and restore lost lands. The railway would deliver weapons, troops, and salvation. They were wrong. Britain was not fighting merely to defeat an enemy, it was fighting to secure an asset. Within weeks of war's outbreak, British forces landed at Basra, officially to protect oil infrastructure. Unofficially, they were racing north along the path of the unfinished railway, determined to seize Mosul and Kirkuk before Germany could. The Middle Eastern theater was merciless. Where European soldiers drowned in mud, men in Mesopotamia died under the sun from disease and exhaustion. The British suffered humiliations including the surrender at Kut. But Britain had resources without limit. The Ottomans did not. The railway meant to save them remained incomplete. Gaps in the mountains forced supplies to be unloaded, hauled by camel or truck, then reloaded, crippling logistics. German aid arrived too slowly. The bottleneck strangled the Ottoman war effort. Had the railway been finished 5 years earlier, history might have turned another way. Instead, Britain regrouped, advanced, and captured Baghdad and Jerusalem. And as the war dragged on, British and French leaders met in secret to carve up Ottoman lands, long before the fighting had ended. They were already writing the next chapter of history. In 1916, two men, Mark Sykes and François Picot, sat across a table with nothing but a map and a pencil between them. With a few deliberate strokes, they carved lines across the Middle East that paid no attention to tribes, faiths, or the land itself. Yet if you study the Sykes-Picot Agreement closely, a darker logic emerges. Those lines trace, almost perfectly, the projected path of the Baghdad Railway and the known locations of oil beneath the ground. Britain claimed southern Iraq and the strategic port of Haifa. France took Syria and Lebanon. Together they were not creating nations, they were dismantling a threat. They were dissecting an empire to ensure that no single power could ever rise from its ruins and challenge them again. The railway that was meant to bind the region together became the blade that split it apart. The betrayal was absolute. Arab leaders had been promised independence if they rose up against Ottoman rule. Lawrence of Arabia, helped lead these revolts, sabotaging bridges and dynamiting the very rail lines the Ottomans depended on. But when the war ended, independence never came. Instead, British and French flags replaced Ottoman ones. The empire was dissolved. The Sultan was cast aside. The Caliphate was abolished. The crushing debt was not erased, only redistributed, forced onto the new states carved from Ottoman lands. Britain had won. Germany was checked. The route to India was secured. And most critically, the oil that would fuel the 20th century now lay firmly under Western control. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway was shattered. Segments lay stranded in Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, disconnected by borders that made a unified system impossible. The great vision of a steel Silk Road was dead. And in its place, a vacuum opened across the Middle East, one that still defines the region today. But the story did not end in 1918. The ghost of the railway lingered throughout the 20th century and has returned with force in the 21st. After the First World War, Britain and France ruled the Middle East, but conquest brought a new problem. They now owned the oil but still had to move it to Europe. The railway they once feared was now under their control, yet it no longer worked. The borders they had drawn fractured it. A train traveling from Baghdad to Europe now crossed multiple customs zones, currencies, and administrations. Economic unity was deliberately broken. This was no accident. A divided Middle East was easier to dominate than a unified one. Railways gave people mobility and ideas. Pipelines did not. So Britain shifted its focus underground. The Iraq Petroleum Company was formed, a consortium of British, French, and American oil giants. A pipeline was built from Kirkuk to the Mediterranean, following almost the same strategic logic as the old railway, but this time, every benefit flowed west. Oil poured out. Development did not flow back. The Ottoman dream of modernization was replaced by an age of extraction. Yet the idea behind the Baghdad Railway refused to die. A land bridge between Europe and Asia is simply too powerful to ignore. During the Second World War, it returned once more. Nazi Germany again looked east. Hitler envisioned access to the oil of Iraq and the Caucasus. German agents stirred rebellion in Baghdad, promising to complete what the Kaiser had begun. Once again, Britain invaded Iraq, not for ideology but for control of oil and corridors. The script barely changed. Only the actors did. Control the corridor. Control the world. After the Second World War, the British Empire collapsed under its own debts. The United States stepped into the vacuum. Washington inherited Britain's obsession with the Middle East, though it used subtler tools, coups, alliances, and proxy wars instead of formal empire. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union became the new specter. American planners feared Soviet tanks rolling through the same passes once traced by the railway. Turkey became a cornerstone of NATO not because of shared values, but because of geography. It sat astride the most valuable crossroads on Earth. Now fast forward to the present. The echoes are impossible to ignore. A rising industrial power challenges a dominant naval empire once again. China is the new Germany. The United States is the new Britain. And the Belt and Road Initiative is the new Baghdad Railway. Like Kaiser Wilhelm before them, China's leaders understand their vulnerability at sea. The US Navy dominates the Pacific and Indian Oceans. In a war, China could be blockaded, its economy starved of energy. So Beijing builds railways, pipelines, ports, and highways across Eurasia, overland routes immune to naval power. Look at the map. The Belt and Road Initiative mirrors the old railway almost exactly, only on a continental scale. Its goal is the same: bypass maritime choke points and bind Asia, Europe, and the Middle East into a single economic system, one that sidelines the dominant naval power. And just as in the early 1900s, panic follows. Newspapers speak of debt traps. Politicians warn of authoritarian influence. Chinese firms are blocked from ports, networks, and infrastructure projects. The language is familiar. The anxiety is identical. The lesson of the Baghdad Railway is brutal but clear. When a fading empire feels its dominance threatened by infrastructure, it will respond with finance, propaganda, and ultimately force. The Middle East remains the board on which this game is played. Iraq, Syria, Iran, Turkey, every modern conflict follows the same fault lines where rails were laid a century ago. This is not coincidence. It is geography. The Ottoman Empire believed it could balance great powers to save itself. It believed it could accept German steel without inheriting German enemies. It was wrong. Infrastructure is never neutral. When you invite a superpower to build your lifelines, you also invite its rivals. You turn your land into a battlefield. The train that was meant to bring prosperity delivered ruin. Today, many developing nations face the same choice. They need roads, power plants, railways. China offers speed and scale. The West offers warnings. They stand trapped between giants just as the Ottomans once were. The enduring truth of the Baghdad Railway is this: a road is never just a road. It is a channel of power. And history shows that empires will burn the world before allowing their rivals to control the flow of trade. When we look at today's chaos in the Middle East, we are told it is about religion, identity, ancient hatred. But dig beneath the sand and you find rusted iron tracks. You uncover a failed business deal. You see borders drawn not to build nations but to stop a train. The wars we fight, the maps we inherit, even the price of fuel at the pump, all trace back to the railway that never reached the sea. The train that never arrived is still shaping the world and still tearing it apart.